Hi, if you're with Tassos today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about racial assimilation, or call it integration. I mean, give it whatever name you like, but how multiple races in the same location can assimilate to the point where there are no real distinguishing characteristics, behavioural characteristics between the groups. Now that can be achieved through a common set of behaviours, or through, for example, intermarriage and procreation, or other means. But how can it be achieved, and how long would it take? Now, different races integrate at different rates. Some races don't want to integrate at all. And I've used an example previously of, say, Fiji, where Indians from the subcontinent have been in Fiji for 170 years, and yet the integration rate is about 5%, a little bit less, in fact. Why are they not integrating? Now, if you take it sort of at that rate, then it would take more than 1,000 years to achieve integration. In fact, be more than that, probably closer to 1,500 years, assuming current trends continued. So now the resistance isn't from the Fijian Islander side; it's from the Indian Hindu side. So now, if you look at say the United States, the slaves have been free since. Remember, not all the blacks in the United States were slaves. There were a lot of black people in the north of the United States that either hadn't been slaves for generations or weren't to begin with. So this idea that every single person in the US, a black person in the US, was a slave is nonsense. That's simply not true. So even if you look at the sort of the assimilation into white culture, given that was the majority culture, and where the money was all coming from, given the assimilation of blacks into white culture is so small, again, even if they had never been slaves, or hadn't been slaves since the late 1700s. That's even there, the assimilation rate, the integration rate into white society is very small. Even where the black people aren't 100% black, there may be 25% or 50% black, but even there, the assimilation rate is quite low. And less than 10%. Now, some are saying it's around 10%. I've even seen figures as high 11 or 12%. Others are claiming it's around 6-7%. But regardless of what it is, and as I used to go to the States a lot, not so much now, but going to the States a lot, and there was a few people that I knew there that were probably, maybe a little bit swarthy. Their hair was maybe a little bit curly, that sort of thing. But I wouldn't have thought, didn't even cross my mind. And they mentioned that they had a grandfather who was black or something like that. So, but even there, the integration rate among those sort of people is not as high as you'd imagine. You think it would be seamless at that point, but it's not. So how can assimilation be achieved, even in situations where there's been no slavery of any sort? There's still, the assimilation is low. If we look at sort of the black people coming to Britain, for example, in post World War II, they hadn't been even, again, not all the blacks in the Caribbean, the British islands in the Caribbean, not all of them had been slaves, and the ones that hadn't been slaves since, I think, 1810, something like that. So they hadn't been slaves for 150 plus years. They came to Britain not as slaves, but as just workers, and yet their integration rate is unusually low. Their behavioural differences are clear and manifest. It can be seen in criminality and their general achievements in school and college and in the workplace and so on. So it's something more than just were or were not slaves or something like that. There are more factors here. It's far more nuanced than just, for example, slavery. Now, to give you to illustrate the point, if you go back to, say, ancient Rome, it was very popular to make Greek teachers and so on as slaves, and bring them to Rome as tutors for the well-off, teaching classical philosophy and mathematics and so on. And so, but it's usually for a period of time. They'd be slaves for 10 years or whatever. And if we look at the Roman government, particularly, say, during the time of Claudius, but even before that, so AD 41 to 54 and beyond, what were called freedmen, that is, people who had been slaves but were now free, they were able to achieve high positions within the Roman government. And if you look at the Emperor Claudius, the top advisor, all his top advisors were Greek, and the most famous being Pallas and Callistus there. So there was yet the Greeks seamlessly integrated into Roman society and married Romans and procreated, this sort of thing. So they were indistinguishable from. Now there were still sort of ancient Roman families that commanded a certain prestige, going back to 400 BC and that sort of thing. But the reality was that the slaves that came to Rome, many of them integrated, very nicely into society. What made Roman society different? Why were they integrating? Now, the same. If I look at Australia, as a lot of immigrants have come to Australia, mostly from the British Isles, but the integration rate varies. So say for example, Polish immigrants now, they tend to say young people arrive. They're 20 years old. They arrive as immigrants. They have children here. The chances are that the children will become Australianized to the point where you wouldn't notice it. Now, if the children don't, particularly if their parents bring out other relatives and sort of go into a Polish area where the Polish diaspora is in abundance, then that would slow down the integration rate. But given that the Polish people came over in relatively small numbers, their integration rate was very high. So by the time the grandchildren came along, the integration was complete. So it's not simply a case of, now they're white and Christian, and that would have helped. But there are some very pale-skinned Greeks that are white and Christian or could pass for such, and they didn't integrate at the same rate. Now, they were mostly, not all, but they were mostly from rural farming areas, and so many of them were illiterate in their own language when they came to Australia. And this is in the immediate post-World War II refugee camps, and also during the communist uprising in Greece following World War II. So they came out, and now I've spoken to the grandchildren of, say, teenage Greek migrants that came over in early 1950s, for example, and the grandchildren around now, they've got jobs, they're growing up and having their own children. And I'm surprised the amount of Greeks who still marry other Greeks, even though they're born in Australia and their parents are born in Australia. Not all do it. There is a decent amount of integration, but the thing about it is that there are still large numbers of Greeks that marry each other and are very concerned about Greek. They still read Greek. They speak Greek because using that Cyrillic sort of character set. And you can tell that there's a twinge on the accent when they talk English, but they've integrated rather slowly. Now, the two reasons for this, one is, or I think a number of reasons. One is their rural background and that sort of thing. So the illiteracy wouldn't have helped. They couldn't speak English when they arrived. That also wouldn't have helped. And they hung around with other Greeks and stuck around with the Greek diaspora. Again, that would have slowed down integration. And also they did things like they opened up corner shops in, selling basic food and grocery items, fruit and vegetables and that sort of thing. A lot of the market gardeners in the outer suburbs of say, Sydney back in the 1950s, a lot of Greeks there, because that was the only expertise they really had. So they'd open up these shops. And now there was laws at the time where you couldn't, I think, employ more than two people in a business that was open on the weekends or in the evenings. So the Greeks got around that by having large families, and then the families would work in the shop, so they could avoid this. You can only have two people working there. The kids would work in the shop, and that sort of cousins would, and so on. So again, they're all talking Greek amongst themselves, hanging around with their Greek buddies and wider Greek family and diaspora. So that slowed things down. So you're looking probably at between 3 and 4 generations born in the West for the Greeks to integrate, but they do. Same really with rural southern Italians or people from old Yugoslavia, Serbia, Croatia, and so on. That's the same. Now, say Hungarian, especially. So I'm looking at a few Hungarians here. They're urban and literate, and they've learnt English before they come to Australia. And as soon as they arrive, they're very diligent about going to night school to make sure their English is fully intact, and they're expanding their vocabulary in English and so on. So they're certainly the ones I've met, at least, are quite diligent. Now they again integrate in probably the first generation, if not the first, definitely the second, integrating. So that's them. Now let's look at some Indians that have come to the West, the rich, wealthy West. Again, 5-6 generations on, they're still sending back to the tribal village of their ancestors to get husbands and brides. So they're not integrating. Very few Indians integrate. And there's been a huge mass of Indians arriving in Australia, and given the first sort of couple of tranches, the children that are born here that are now in their mid-20s, their integration rate is very low. Some of this is the Indian determination to stay genetically pure, and the view that the white Anglo-Saxons are morally and spiritually inferior to them, and so. If the young males and females that are again born here and they're now in their mid-20s are thinking about marriage and procreation and so on, the parents and the wider family units, the aunts, the uncles, the whole thing, they're saying to these people, look, if you want to quietly and discreetly date some white boys or girls or whatever, that's fine, but when it comes to marriage, you must marry an Indian, and we'll arrange a bride for you from India. So they don't even like the idea of the local born boy or girl marrying another Indian local. Even that's a little bit off limits. So they want to keep the Indian connection and the Indian culture and the genetic. They want to keep it really fresh, and they want to refresh it, freshen it up or refresh it every generation. And they're really adamant on this. And I know a lady who probably late 20s now, but she wants to marry an Indian boy who was born in Australia, and she's coming under withering pressure from her parents not to do it. And at one stage when she was a bit younger, she was thinking of marrying an Anglo boy, and the parents hit the roof. They almost didn't talk to her for 6 months. Just for entertaining that outrageous idea, and from their perspective. So the Indian integration is very slow. Now looking at the black integration in the United States or anywhere really outside of Africa. And bear in mind in Africa, by the way, the integration or the assimilation between the different African tribes is also very low. And they're all black. The integration is very low indeed. But coming to say the United States, the behavioral attitudes and the behavior of the black Africans in Africa, they've transplanted very successfully and almost completely that same behavior into the United States. Whether they were freed, 100 years before the Civil War, or whether they were and living in the North, which is far more liberal. Wherever it is, their behaviour is still the same. Their attitude to communal ownership is still the same. Their behaviour attitude in terms of living on the of the street gangs and the idea that property is to be shared, it can't really be owned, and all these sorts of things. This is very African and African tribal and rural tribal, and that's being transplanted almost completely to the United States or to the Caribbean, and then now transplanted to Britain. They've got that same concept. You see the black activists in the United States, they have the thing, but you white people, you got so much, you should share it with us. Well, why don't you? And so this idea of personal ownership is something that the black diaspora doesn't grasp or grasp minimally, if at all. Now you'll get people that do, Thomas Sowell or something. Sure, you'll get that, but or back through history, the Booker T. Washingtons and so on. But this idea of ownership and if you have a group of people that don't believe in private ownership and it's a capitalist society, and they have a view that, well, why should we go away to work hard to acquire anything? Why don't you people who've got more just give it to us? Then they've got this welfare mentality that really stays with them. It's very destructive. If they wanted to go back to Africa, for example, then they would. Well, I'm not sure they'd fit in after having been in a first world country for that long, but they would still today relate to this communal ownership thing, and they would be able to relate to that as much today as they would have, from 400 years ago. So assimilation there is a different project. Now, if we look at the very, and even in Australia, there's been very determined and certainly very well-intentioned attempts to integrate the local Aborigines here. And the local Aborigines, by the way, came from southern India when the land bridge existed, 30,000 odd years ago. They came across through New Guinea and through Cape York and into Australia. And then the sea level rose and the land bridge was closed off. But there's been serious attempts to integrate them in different ways with white society. In one instance, they were putting all Aboriginal children were required to attend schools, mainly run by various churches and philanthropic groups, so they would get an education and be able to speak the language and understand behaviours and how to sit at a table and eat from a plate and this sort of thing, which going back the years, that was these sort of things were basic. So there was an attempt to say, well, let's teach the basics. Now let's add education on. Now let's add high school education. Now let's add college education, and so on. So there's been a very genuine or various attempts, very mixed results though, and in other cases where say the parents had died or were too ill or something like that, they would take children and would be adopted into white families and would receive all the benefits, usually quite well-to-do white families, and they receive all the benefits of being brought up, from the time of being a young child, being brought up with a white family and then knowing nothing other than a white existence. And yet those people too haven't integrated very small number have. and nearly all of them become activists rather than get a job and so on. They become activists. And I remember this was a business meeting quite some years ago now, but there was this guy who was being a bit divvy. He was demanding an awful lot that wasn't consistent with the sort of the type of discussion we were having. And at one point he just jumped up in the middle of the meeting and you're discriminating against me because I'm an Aborigine and I'm going to take you to the Special Aboriginal Court for discrimination. And I had I remember my jaw just dropped. I had no idea he was a bit swarthy and everything, but apparently he was a quarter or an eighth or something Aboriginal, and which is enough to qualify as full blood in I don't know about today, but certainly at the time. And so, wow, I didn't know that. Oh, yes, you did, you discriminating Nazi. And yeah. So the activism was acute, has been acute for quite some time. But I sort of persevered with him, and he told me that he'd been brought up in a white family because his some Aboriginal ancestor had died or something like that, and so he ended up having a white existence. And then there was his grandfather or grandmother had been with a white guy, and so on and so forth. But and he's been brought up in two generations really of white families, and even then he still was very, very jumpy, very prickly, very chip on shoulder about the whole thing. So I'd say even his integration was questionable. So how can assimilation integration take place? It's very nuanced, and the attempts over 200 years to integrate the Aborigines has failed to the point where now in Australia there's a lot of talk about setting up a completely separate parliament for Aborigines. Now, full-blood Aborigines make up less than 1% of the population. So, and people that have got a quarter or an eighth are wanting to freeload over the whole thing and spot an opportunity to score some easy cash and that sort of stuff. But that's where it's at, even 200 years later. So any attempt to the Aborigines that were taken into white families has now been called the stolen generation, where evil whitey sort of stole these children from the middle class, prosperous bosom of their family and this sort of stuff, which is nothing could have been further from the truth. These people were usually taken from remote, rural, tribal villages where disease and malnutrition and so on were, and petty tribal warfare were rampant. So no, these children were certainly more rescued than stolen. But anyway, the thing is the integration. Again, given there were many attempts in many different ways, the integration has been a resounding failure. And also there's a failure to debate the issues and to take the corrective action. For example, there was a ban on allowing the social welfare payment cards to be used for alcohol, and but that was viewed as racist. So the left-leaning government that came in some months ago, they've taken that ban off. They said, no, you can use your welfare payments to buy alcohol. So there's now been an explosion in violence and rioting and all sorts of drama given the alcohol that's being consumed in some of these rural townships. But it can't be discussed because to even mention that black people are rioting and this that thing, is viewed as racist or far right, white supremacist and so on. So it can't even be discussed. But again, that's been a failure. So where you look at integration and assimilation, the rates of assimilation integration, the more sophisticated the society or the person and the lifestyle they've had, the more likely assimilation is going to be possible coming to the West. When it's the reverse, when the white people are going to the black countries and they're building railways and ports and all sorts of things, that's a different form of I suppose an economic element of integration or assimilation. But as soon as the white people go, the whole thing the whole thing falls into disrepair, as we've seen in Zimbabwe and elsewhere around Africa, and of course South Africa now. South Africa is turning into a basket case when it's one of the richest countries in the world only 25 years ago. So I think assimilation integration is really a very complex thing, and it's absurd to try and bring people into a country, as immigrants or refugees, or call it whatever you like, that are unlikely or minimally likely to integrate. So the key things are people that can speak the language well. I mean, if it's in Germany, speak German well. England, speak English well. That sort of stuff. That they've had a metropolitan, cosmopolitan existence, and they've minimum finished an international standard of high school education, preferably, maybe some sort of college, that they've got some work experience or skill, and that they can find work, because it's not that hard on the internet now. They can find work in the country they want to go to, and they're not going to send back to the country of their origin for brides and husbands and that sort of thing. I think that has to be agreed to. Otherwise, no immigration status. You can't bring out your wider family. Your cousins and aunts and uncles can't do that. And people aren't allowed to stay in a race, like within their diaspora. So like in Australia now, or in Sydney, entire suburbs are now wall-to-wall Indians. You went to the local supermarket, you'd be lucky to see anyone who's not Indian. Now, as a result, they're already very, very resistant to integrating. Once that happens and they're all there, it makes it impossible. So integration, assimilation is possible, but the numbers have to be relatively small. The people have to be spread, very careful selection of the people, and they have to lose their connection with they can go back and visit their place of birth if they want, but they have to cut their connection with that country, with the place of birth. They have to say, this is now my country, this is now my society. And so they focus on making it work and integrating, not only financially, but socially. So, and if you look at countries where very small numbers of people have come to Australia, the smaller the number of people, even if it's not from another first world country, the integration rate is very high. When Russians first started coming to Australia in small numbers, nearly all of them married locals. Not all, but nearly all married locals, or a very high number. And so the integration rate was quite quick. Again, they were white and Christian, and that helps. But the material point is they came out in small numbers. They didn't cluster and congregate in one area. They spread out, and they integrated quite well, quite quickly. But then larger numbers of Russians started to come. So instead of a few thousand, they started to arrive in the tens of thousands, and that changed everything. They moved into certain areas in Sydney that are now wall-to-wall Russian. Again, you go to the supermarkets or stores around there, and all you can hear is Russian being spoken, because there's so many, and they keep Russian amongst themselves. They bring out their their babushkas, their grandmothers, and so on. They bring them out and bring out the other people from their village, particularly if it's a rural. They've come from a rural area rather than a major metropolitan centre, and so on. So, and even the Russians that are now the Russians that are born here, they are marrying other Russians that were born here, and so again keeping that together. Now, I think they will integrate over time. I think it'll just take maybe a little bit longer. But the point being that I'm illustrating here, when people come over in sufficient numbers and congregate in certain suburbs and geographical areas, it slows down by between 1 and 2 generations the rate of integration and assimilation. So there are a whole lot of things need to be done to to achieve assimilation. And in the case of, say, the blacks in the United States, I can't find anywhere in the world, anywhere, where black Africans have successfully integrated into any other society, even other black societies in Africa. So that tribal thing is very, very strong with them. And so and again, even half black or quarter blacks in the United States, they too are not integrating into the United States or into the West generally. So need to do a much better job of selecting migrants, and then once selected, once saying, well, this group is the most likely to integrate. So blacks and Indians and Pakistanis need to be taken out. Most Islamic, it's not going to work. And there has to be found another way or a different way if assimilation is to take place. You've been with Tassis today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.